Hello everyone. In this class we are going to talk about the sound laws. The sound laws are slightly different from sound changes. The sound changes that we have discussed already are categorized into various types which are cross-linguistically relevant. But sound laws are language specific. We will see how they are language specifically relevant. The sound laws also played an important role in the history of Indo-European studies and as a consequence in the overall history of historical linguistics as a field of study. The first one, that is the first sound law, that is Grimm's law, was quite general and accounted for the majority of sound correspondences involving the stop series between Germanic and non-Germanic languages. As you know, Germanic and non-Germanic languages both are derivative of the PIE language family. However, as initially formulated, it did appear to have certain exceptions. When Hermann Grassmann discovered his law in 1862, a large block of these exceptions, which existed in Grimm's law, was explained, and then Karl Verner, through his law, Verner's law, in 1877, 15 years later, explained most of the remaining exceptions. So Grimm's law was the first law, and then certain exceptions were noted which were explained through Grassmann's law and then Verner's law. Now this is the year of the 200 years have passed after Grimm's law, because Grimm's law was formulated in 1822. This success of explaining the exceptions in accounting for what had originally appeared to be exception of Grimm's law led to the neo-grammarians to the confidence that sound change was regular and exceptionless. This is one of the most significant conclusions in the history of linguistics. Neo-grammarians' hypothesis, as you know, had this axiom, the famous axiom, that sound laws or sound changes operate without exceptions. But when Grimm's law was formulated and later on some exceptions were found, that axiom of neo-grammarian hypothesis was decoded, and then again Grassmann and Werner had explained those exceptions. So sound laws now are not taken as exceptionless, unlike the initial formulation by neo-grammarians. The first law, as we know, is Grimm's law, which was formulated in 1822. This is the 200 years of Grimm's law. Grassmann's law was formulated 40 years later in 1862. That was the second law. Werner's law was formulated in 1877, 15 years after Grassmann's law had come. Then came Fortunatov's law in 1881. So for almost 60 years, six decades, these four laws have talked about Indo-European linguistics in very vast way. The historical development of how the Indo-European languages have developed from PIE, Proto-Indo-European, and had spread across the world. These laws have looked into many of the sound changes that occurred in Indo-European linguistics in various branches and various languages. The last law, which is known as Dahl's law, formulated in 1903, is not about Indo-European linguistics. This is the only law, only famous sound law which does not deal with Indo-European linguistics, but it talks about Proto-Bantu languages. We will have detailed discussions on that in this class. Now let's first look into Grimm's law. Grimm's law, named after Jakob Grimm, who had proposed this particular law, is an extremely important set of sound changes in historical linguistics. So, as I said, it was the first law which was propounded in the domain of historical linguistics. It is intimately involved in the history of comparative method and regularity hypothesis. Both had very great connection to the assumption which was propounded by Jakob Grimm in 1822. It covers three interrelated changes in the series of stops, oral plosives, from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic. So this particular law, sound law, talks about the derivation from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic. The different stages of Grimm's law illustrate a pattern of relative chronology which we have learned in the last class. First, Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Pa, Proto-Ta, and Proto-Ka had become Fa, Tha, Ha in Germanic, and at a later stage, Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Ba, Proto-Da, and Proto-Ga became Pa, Ta, Ka in Germanic. So as you can see, there is a relative chronology. We have explained this in the previous video where we have talked that had there been a sequence which was opposite to this, there would not have been any stop in the Germanic languages, but that is not the case. All the stop would have become fricative in Germanic, and that is not the case. As we know, Germanic still has certain instances of stops, both voiceless and voiced, and that is why this is the relative chronology, that first voiceless stops had become voiceless fricative, and at a later stage voice stops had become voiceless stops. And as you can see on the right side of the slide, this is the relative chronology which happened or which was explained through Grimm's law. So in the first stage, voiceless stop had become voiceless fricatives, all these stops, including qua, which is a labialized velar sound. It became hua. In some of the books and some of the literature, you may also see that it became ha, and that is an allophone. But we are not concerned about the allophonic variation as of now. The second stage, voice stops became voiceless stops, as we have already noted here, and all these sounds have become these sounds. So gua became qua, and so on. Another third change or third stage of sound change occurred between voiced aspirated or murmured stopped, which became plain voice stops. For example, bha became ba, proto-dha became da, proto-gha became ga, and proto-ghwa became gwa. So these are the three sound changes that were explained through the sound law called Grimm's law. So these are the real formulation or original formulation of the Grimm's law. PIE, plain voiceless stops, became Proto-Germanic voiceless fricatives, as noted here. PIE, plain voice stops, became Proto-Germanic plain voiceless stops, as noted in this para, and PIE, voiced aspirated stop, became Proto-Germanic plain voiceless stops or voiced fricatives. So whether it will become voice stops or voice fricative is a different discussion altogether. As you can see, most of the uh, voiced aspirated stops, which are also known as breathy voiced or murmured sounds, had become plain voice stops. In certain cases, they also became voiced fricatives, as noted here, and they gave rise to allophonic variation. But that is not our concern right now. There are some important facts about Grimm's law, and as you will understand after some time spending with historical linguistics, that Grimm's law is the most important and most widely discussed sound law among all the 5 laws. Let's learn about some of the important facts about this law. Grimm's law holds only when these sounds are found after the vowel that carries the stress or are in a word initial position. That means this law is encountered only in phonologically strong position. As you know, stressed position within a word is a phonologically strong position, and word initial position also is a phonologically strong position. Okay, so in phonologically strong position, those kind of sound changes that we have listed in the previous slide 2 slides in fact, those are encountered in phonologically strong positions like stressed syllable and word initial position of a word. Secondly, exceptions do exist in Grimm's law, and those are interpreted in the next sound law called Verner's law, and some other were also interpreted through Grassmann's law. We will see and we will discuss that. Both Grimm's law and the English great vowel shift that we have discussed in the previous class are examples of unconditioned sound changes. This is a very crucial point you need to take a note, because this is a question that generally comes in the competitive exams, that whether Grimm's law is a conditioned change or unconditioned. The answer is it is an unconditioned sound change. It is also known as the first Germanic consonant shift, GCS. Unlike GVS, which stands for English Great Vowel Shift, this is known as Germanic consonant shift, GCS. Grimm's law can also be interpreted as either a pull chain or a push chain, where the, and the represent all the stops of this series. So you can go back to the previous class and see what happens in a pull chain and what happens in a push chain, and then come and see what happens in Grimm's law. So you may be able to figure out why it is said that it can be both interpreted as a pull chain or a push chain. Illustrations from Spanish, French, English, Latin, and Sanskrit can be found on page 43 from your textbook. You can look into more detail to understand better the concept of Grimm's law. There are two exceptions which exist in the original formulation of Grimm's law. And after explaining those exceptions, we have the historical linguistics have reformulated the Grimm's law in a different way. We will see into that. Let's first look into the first exception. There were cases where voiceless stops had not changed into fricatives, unlike formulated in the first criteria, that was all the voiceless stops will become voiceless fricatives. And that can be reformulated as PIE plain voiceless stops became Proto-Germanic voiceless fricative, except when PIE stop was preceded by an obstruent. So there was a condition which was imposed, and then that was reformulated. The second two were unconditioned change. All the PIE plain voice stops became Proto-Germanic plain voiceless stops, and all the PIE voiced spirited stops became Proto-Germanic plain voice stops. And these two are regarded as unconditioned change, unlike the first one, which was now reformulated as a condition change. The second exception that exists in Grimm's law formulation, there were cases where voiceless stops had changed but to a voice segment rather than a voiceless fricative. And this exception could be accounted for by a later change interpreted in the next sound law called Verner's law. We will look into Verner's law. The development of historical linguistics is closely associated with the study of Indo-European linguistics, as we have understood so far. Grimm's law, Grassmann's law, and Verner's law are the major milestones in the history of Indo-European and thus also in historical linguistics. And traditionally, all linguists have had to learn these laws. So without knowing and understanding these three laws, you cannot assume that you have read or covered the entire proportion that is in the field called historical linguistics. So you must know all these laws that come under Indo-European linguistics. It was named after its discoverer Karl Verner which was propounded in 1877, in which Proto-Germanic non-initial voiceless fricative became voiced. This is interesting. Non-initial voiceless fricative. That means it's a condition change. If the fricative occurred between voice segments and was preceded by an unstressed syllable. So this is slightly complicated because of its formulation, that it's a very, very specifically occurring sound change or sound law in Proto-Germanic languages, because not all the voiceless fricative become voiced. There are many conditions which were applied to it. They have to be non-initial, and they have to be between two voice segments, and has to be preceded by another unstressed syllable. Verner's law occurred after Grimm's law, and that the former feeds the later is a very important axiom again. In many of the competitive exam, this question comes: Verner's law occurred after Grimm's law, and that the former, that means the Verner's law, feeds the later. So there is a feeding relationship between these two. Okay, so Verner's law created environment where Grimm's law can be seen. In part of Grimm's law, Proto-Indo-European voiceless stop series became voiceless fricative in Proto-Germanic, as in Indo-European proto-pa, proto-ka, proto-ta, proto-qua became Germanic fa, tha, ha, and hua respectively. However, Grimm's law holds only when these sounds are found after the vowel that carries the stress or are in word initial position. Verner's law also accounts for the apparent exceptions to Grimm's law, in which Germanic fricatives are predictably or allophonically voiced. So you can see examples which were from Sanskrit, Greek, and Lithuanian in your textbook, and try to understand what actually happened in those languages and what are the traces of those kind of voice fricatives in those languages which are known as cognates. By Grimm's law, Germanic medial voiceless fricative reflexes correspond to voiceless stops in the other languages. Old English, you can see all these examples which come from Old English, and compare those into other Germanic languages. So Old English, this, Latin, Gothic, Sanskrit, Gothic again, Greek, and Old High German. There are some examples. You can note this down and see what happened to those sounds in Sanskrit, Greek, and Lithuanian cognates. However, other forms seeming exceptions to Grimm's law, so intervocalic voiced fricatives, proto-ba, proto-the, and proto-tsa, as in Gothic Sibun, Sanskrit Sapta, Old English Swadar, and Sanskrit Peter, etc. And those are still remaining in those languages. Verner also discovered that these cases could be explained by taking into account the placement of the original Proto-Indo-European stress. So stress is another parameter which is noted in this kind of language changes, which were explained in both Grimm's law as an exception number 1 and most formulations of the Verner's law. When stress preceded the medial fricative in the later was voiceless, but when it was followed, the medial fricative was voiced. Now let's come to Grassmann's law. This is another very famous case of sound law, and interestingly, unlike the first two laws like Grimm's law and Verner's law, Grassmann's law talk about the process called dissimilation. And this is less complicated to understand, unlike Grimm's law and Verner's law. It was first propounded by Hermann Grassmann in 1862, that involves regular dissimilation in Greek and Sanskrit, where in root of words with two aspirated stops in the first dissimulates to an unaspirated stop. So basically, a sequence of two aspirated stops in these two languages, Greek and Sanskrit, became one aspirated and one unaspirated. So it is a clear case of dissimilation. The consonants involved are voiced aspirated stops in Sanskrit and voiceless aspirated stops in Greek. In Greek and Sanskrit, Grassmann's law regularly dissimulated the first of two aspirated stops within a word so that the first lost its aspiration, as in the change from Proto-Indo-European dhi, dhe, mi for I put place to Sanskrit da, dha, mi. So as you can see here, dha and dha are sequences of two aspirated stops, but when it developed into Sanskrit word, only one aspiration was retained and the other was dissimulated. So these two similar sounds, which were originally two aspirated stops, have become a sequence of two dissimilar sounds. Similarly, also in Greek, it became thi became ti. So, as we have said, voiceless aspirated stop. It became voiceless aspirated stop in Greek. So Sanskrit retained the voicing of the stops, but Greek underwent a separate change because this again had made the stops voiceless. As a result of Grassmann's law, some sound correspondences between Sanskrit, Greek, and Germanic languages do not match the expectation from Grimm's law. So you can see very interesting examples of Grassmann's law both in Sanskrit and Greek here. Please pay attention to the reddened sounds. Bha bhu bha became ba bhu bha in Sanskrit. So two sequence of two aspirated sounds bha and bha became ba and bha. Similarly in Greek it became pa pha sequence became pa pha sequence. So it's a clear case of dissimilation. Another example is found from the development of PIE to Greek. Proto-thrik os became trichos. So a sequence of proto the kha became the kha. So this particular sound had removed its aspiration and became dissimulated to this. However, it was also assumed that Grassmann's law did not apply to some of the following forms, and Kha lost its aspiration because of the following sounds that was following sa. Proto Kha, a sequence of Proto Kha to sa became Ka to Ka and sa. Instead of it is getting dissimulated to Tha, it was actually dissimilation due to the following sa, not because of tha but because of sa. So this was an apparent exception to Grassmann's law, which was explained later, but we are not going to discuss that. Now we come to the fourth law, that again is a discussion of Proto-Indo-European linguistics. That is called Fortunatov's law. Fortunatov's law describes a very simple sound change that happens in Sanskrit. The sequence of a la, which is a lateral, and a dental, any dental sound. This kind of a lateral dental sequence results in a loss of la and an eventual change of the dental to a lingual, that is a cerebral or a retroflex. Earlier, as you might know or might not know, retroflex sounds were also known as lingual or cerebral, because Fortunatov law, as we have already noted, it was originally formulated in 1903. This was a law which was during that time, for retroflex sounds these two words were used. That was the that time convention. So you can see this example pre-Sanskrit, so earlier version of a Sanskrit, proto palta, where there is a sequence of la and dental, became Sanskrit pata, so it became a retroflex, and then dropping of the la made the dental sound a retroflex sound. So this is just one example to explain Fortunatov's law. You can also compare these forms with Old Slavic and Russian, where the law was retained and some other changes were occurred. This law also explains why Indo-European languages except Sanskrit have the common combination of la plus dental, but Sanskrit has lost this kind of a sequence because, as explained by Fortunatov law, whenever there was a sequence of la and a dental sound, this particular sound change had made it clear that the la was dropped and then the dental was made or converted to a retroflex sound. It also attempts to explain the controversy whether L and R are two different distinctive sounds or R was the only original sound. Interestingly, the distinctive nature of L and R, which is a lateral and a rhotic, can be established even without the help of Fortunatov's law, because all the Indo-European languages, as we know, apart from Indo-Iranian, like including Persian languages and all, distinguish these two sounds phonemically. So in our languages that we speak in Indian subcontinent, all the Indo-European languages or Indo-Aryan languages, in fact, distinctively use or distinguish between la and ra separately, and these two are phonemes. The last sound law, that is called Dahl's law, was named after its propounder called Edmund Dahl. He was a missionary who walked in African continent for a prolonged period of time, and he has discovered that in East African Bantu languages, two voiceless consonants in a word dissimilate so that the first become voiced. So it is again like Grassmann's law. Dahl's law is also a case of dissimilation. It explains dissimilation in East African Bantu languages, including Kikuyu and Nyamwezi. So in Kikuyu, as you can see the reddened sounds, a word like Kikuyu became Gikuyu. That means a sequence of two voiceless sounds become dissimilar to each other, and one of it became a voiced sound. That means two similar sounds became dissimilar to each other. Similar examples you can find here. And in Nyamwezi, Khathi became Gathi. Again, sequence of two voiceless sounds, Kha and Tha, became Ga and Tha. Pa and Tha became Ba and Tha. Dahl's law is often portrayed as the African equivalent of Grassmann's law of Indo-European languages, because like Grassmann's law, it also explains a process that is dissimilation.